And now I have to change the disc because this is one long movie. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and in this episode we are going to be taking a look at part 2 of the 2003 Civil War epic Gods and Generals. As we mentioned in our previous episode, this is a film both beloved and maligned by enthusiasts within the Civil War community, and we are going to do our utmost to be separating fact from fiction in this Civil War drama. We left off last time by concluding in late 1861, and accordingly what we're going to be doing in this episode is that we will be examining the scope of the film within the year 1862. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and continue our breakdown of Gods and Generals.
Men of the 20th Maine Regiment of Volunteers, this is your commanding officer, Colonel Adelbert Ames.
Adelbert Ames was appointed commander of the 20th Maine in 1862, and this was a man who had proved his mettle as an artillerist at the battles of First Bull Run. He had served on the Peninsula Campaign. 30 years after the war, he will be awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroics at the Battle of First Bull Run in 1861. He later serves as a brigade commander at the Battle of Gettysburg in the 11th Corps, serves in additional heroic capacities throughout the remainder of the conflict. He becomes Reconstruction governor of the state of Mississippi, and he served as a liberal radical Republican who was very much in favor of civil rights and enfranchisement for the emancipated slaves of the South. And he later goes on to serve in the Spanish-American War. And I believe he was the last living Civil War general. He died in 1933. And so this guy had a very long and storied life. And for the purposes of this film, he was absolutely instrumental in instructing Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in the School of the Soldier.
Major Gilmore, see if you can teach them to march.
Yes, sir. Colonel Chamberlain, come with me.
It's also worth noting that this scene set at Camp Mason in Maine in 1862 was actually filmed on September 11th, 2001. And so as you can very well guess, many of the people on set were very distraught as bits of information were coming in about what was transpiring. And I was told by some reenactors who were on the set, some of whom were active duty military and National Guardsmen, actually had to leave the set because they thought they were going to be called up in this state of national emergency.
Line of battle consists of 2 lines of men, one behind the other, so that while one line fires, the other reloads. Behind them is a line of file closes.
Joshua Chamberlain was entrusted to the supervision of Adelbert under Ames with the understanding that Chamberlain was a very quick learner. After all, he was a multilingual college professor who was a brilliant academic, especially in the context of mid-19th century America, when most citizens barely had a middle school education. And so he thus committed to the understanding of military tactics. And these conversations here that he has with Ames are very much foreshadowing of one of his first big calls to battle, and that is at Fredericksburg, only a few months away.
But that move must be practiced and practiced and practiced. Another month and we'll be ready. But we leave for Washington tomorrow.
There are so many Civil War memoirs that attest to the repetition and monotony of soldier life in camp. It was a matter of drill, drill, and more drill. And there are so many wonderful first-hand accounts attesting to this. The likes of Elijah Hunt Rhodes from Rhode Island certainly comes to mind in this regard.
Morning to you, sir. Colonel Ames sent me to get you. Said he thought you might be needing a drop of this.
Oh, thank you.
Kill rain, sir. Sergeant Kilrain. Glad to be of service.
And in this scene, we are reintroduced to the beloved character of Buster Kilrain, who is one of the more memorable characters from the 1993 movie Gettysburg, which came out 10 years before this film. And it's worth reinforcing the point that Buster Kilrain is a fictional character. He was a means for the author of The Killer Angels, Michael Shera, to insert himself into the story, if you will. And his character carries over into this film accordingly. When I worked at Gettysburg National Military Park as a ranger, every now and again, a visitor would come to the front desk and they would ask to know where Buster Kilrain was buried in the Soldiers National Cemetery. And I was almost heartbroken to inform them that this Irish sergeant, in fact, did not exist.
And end up shooting at one another in the land of the free.
I too have friends on the other side, Sergeant.
That's one of the best lines in the movie, and I'm so glad Jeff Daniels was the one to deliver it. The idea that, yes, I knew people who are on the other side, but he firmly acknowledges that they are traitors who are now my enemy. What we see here is a building standing in for a real-life structure known as Chatham Manor, which is on the heights opposite of Fredericksburg, Virginia, overlooking the Rappahannock River. This was built by dozens of enslaved people in the year 1771, and it's one of these storied structures from the history of colonial Virginia and beyond. Its halls were occupied by the likes of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and a younger Robert E. Lee as they were making the social circles and the social rounds as they were ascending to power. And it is a structure that still stands today. It is part of Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania National Military Park, and it is a fascinating place. After the battle, people by the likes of Clara Barton and Walt Whitman were involved in various recovery efforts there. And it's an often overlooked landmark among many people who go to visit the Fredericksburg battlefield. And it's a place that I highly encourage you to check out.
General Burnside, if we don't cross the river very soon, I'm confident General Lee will make every effort to stop us. He's not going to let us move toward Richmond unopposed. Where are General Jackson's forces now? Shouldn't we make some attempt to occupy Fredericksburg and possibly the heights beyond now, while we have it for the taking?
What we see here is a fairly accurate representation of some of the friction that existed within the high command of the Army of the Potomac. And if you want to get a really good sense of how a lot of this unfolded in the manner that it did, a book that you want to check out is called The Fredericksburg Campaign by Frank O'Reilly, who is one of the top historians in this subject matter and is a park ranger at the Fredericksburg battlefield. And he sums up this situation quite well. He says, Burnside notified Lincoln, I think now that the enemy will be more surprised by a crossing immediately in our front than in any other part of the river. This was contrary to Edwin Sumner's advice and Lincoln's wish for a secure crossing with no means of Confederate escape. Yet Burnside believed he had run out of options. O'Reilly goes on to say thereafter, he, Burnside, planned a quick lunge across the river, which would catch the Southerners divided and unprepared for the most decisive battle of the war. A lightning thrust would cut off the Confederates above Fredericksburg from those below. Among those most frustrated by this somewhat lackadaisical assessment of the entire situation was Winfield Scott Hancock, who we just saw in this scene. On this point, O'Reilly notes, Sumner tried to quell the furor, but his generals persisted. Second Corps Chief Darius N. Couch thought, quote, Sumner seemed to feel badly that the officers did not agree to Burnside's mode of advance. Couch and the new division commander, Winfield S. Hancock, led the opposition. Burnside was, quote, irritated when he learned of it. For some reason, Burnside was particularly hurt by Hancock's remarks. Burnside allegedly told the courier carrying Couch's objections to, quote, say to General Couch that he is mistaken. Therefore, we can get a very good sense of this inner sort of turmoil that exists within the power structure of the Army of the Potomac.
Did you know, General, that George Washington spent his boyhood not far from here?
That may be so, Mr. Taylor, but it has an even greater significance to me. It's where I met my wife.
Although Fredericksburg, Virginia did indeed have sentimental value to Robert E. Lee, one cannot underestimate or underscore enough the importance in its strategic level. If you look at a map, Fredericksburg, Virginia is located roughly halfway between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. It being smack dab between these two opposing capitals placed it on a collision course with history. And in roughly an 18-month time period between the late winter of 1862 in the spring of 1864, well over 100,000 casualties were inflicted within the county in which Fredericksburg sits. It was an absolutely devastated area of a state that was already torn apart, shredded to pieces by this horrible war.
Well, some officers in this army who are of the opinion that we should be enlisting Negroes as a condition for freedom.
That's what they says round the camp.
Your people will be free, one way or t'other.
This scene takes place outside the Chancellor Mansion that was located within the wilderness, situated roughly about 20 miles south of Fredericksburg, Virginia. And in this scene, it is the setting for one of the more ridiculous conversations within this movie, where Stonewall Jackson ensures his enslaved laborer that he will in fact be free someday. And the absurdity of this bit of dialogue is almost beyond comprehension. The idea of a Confederate general looking down upon a man in bondage and making the claim that there's great things ahead for you and me within this Confederacy. It's all a bunch of hogwash. There is no strong rooting in reality into this conversation. All we need to do is to consider the level of anger and vitriol in response to the release of the forthcoming Emancipation Proclamation. This article from Encyclopedia Virginia states on this issue, in white Southerners' eyes, those black soldiers were rebellious enslaved laborers, and their white officers were guilty of inciting servile insurrection. Both could be executed under Southern state laws, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered that all black men captured in Union uniforms be either executed or re-enslaved. More often, they were put to work on Confederate fortifications alongside impressed enslaved laborers. As far as Confederate leaders were concerned, black men were laborers, not soldiers.
The only question is whether the Southern government will have the good sense to do it first and soon, and in so doing seal a bond of enduring friendship between us.
The paranoia and the hesitance to recruit black men into the Confederate ranks was rooted in long-standing fears about slave uprisings and insurrections. We only need to look what happens in 1830s Virginia, 3 decades prior to this, in the case of the Nat Turner Rebellion. White people did not want black men walking around with guns, period.
We got batteries pointing from all angles. They try to cross that canal, that's going to slow them down. We shall hit them from all sides. No, sir, a chicken couldn't live on that field.
The conversation that we see here between E. Porter Alexander and Robert E. Lee is based in fact, and presumably Porter Alexander does in fact say that no, sir, a chicken couldn't live on that field. And this is a guarantee that he would back up with great fierceness in the coming days. When I often give tours on Civil War battlefields, people are often surprised by the capacity of Civil War artillery. Some of the rifled guns that we see in these scenes could, at maximum range, perhaps lob an artillery shell nearly 2 miles. This often astounds people. And here on the plains below Mary's Heights overlooking Fredericksburg, it would be something apocalyptic for those who were on the receiving end of it.
That wily gray fox has outmaneuvered our command again. And there's going to be hell to pay.
Winfield Scott Hancock had an incredible capacity to prognosticate, to be able to predict things that were going to happen. He had an incredibly uneasy feeling about this crossing at Fredericksburg, facing off, marching up to the heights that were overlooking the community, in the same way that he had an uneasy feeling about the movement of Sickles' 3rd Corps at Gettysburg just a few months later. And as he saw those troops moving forward, he turned to one of his subordinates and he said, "You'll soon see them tumbling back."
Pick your targets, boys! And bang!
In the pre-dawn hours of December 11th, 1862, United States engineers had great difficulty maneuvering some of these unwieldy pontoon boats down the deep slopes of Stafford Heights opposite of Fredericksburg. And the clanging and banging of their boats as they were working their way to the riverbank, dropping those boats in, starting to lay the planks in methodical fashion over them. The Confederates couldn't see them across the river yet. It was a cold, misty, dark morning, yet they knew the Federals were over there, preparing to cross. And as soon as some of that mist lifted, as soon as it became light enough, the sharpshooters of General William Barksdale commenced to open firing. These Confederates were hiding within every nook and cranny, attic, basement, window, and behind every box and barrel on the riverbanks of Fredericksburg. And what it leads to is one of really the first contested river crossing as Army engineers are trying to forge a bridgehead in combat. The actor and character of William Barksdale likewise has a brief appearance in the movie Gettysburg. And while we're on the subject of slavery, it is worth noting William Barksdale's opinion on this matter. He was this firebrand secessionist, a slave-holding politician from Mississippi, and in the year 1856, this is what he had to say. "I deny the power of Congress to legislate upon the subject of slavery anywhere except to protect it. That is my position. We are done, gentlemen, with compromise." And in so saying, William Barksdale foresees the coming Civil War to protect his economic interests. Although Barksdale does a very effective job in stalling the United States river crossing here at Fredericksburg, he does in fact meet his end at Gettysburg only a few months later in 1863.
Mother, you stop your fussing with me. You get your own family ready. We'll all of us leave together.
Miss Jane, now you know us and talked this over, and we decided to stay on here and look after the house.
We made reference to the real-life character of Jane Beale in episode 1 of our breakdown of Gods and Generals. And as I said, her historic home still stands today at 305 Lewis Street in the historic district of Fredericksburg, Virginia. And one of the reasons why writer-director Ron Maxwell opted to incorporate her into this storyline is because she left a very vivid diary account that was subsequently published. And on this point, Beale had this to say of the U.S. artillery bombardment upon her community. "Brother John told us that the town was on fire in many places. A whole row of buildings on Main Street were already burnt. And as my house had a shingled roof, I thought we would soon be driven from it by fire also. Mr. Lacey left us with Brother John, and they could scarcely have gotten out of town before the heavy bombardment commenced again, and the sound of 173 guns echoed in our ears. The shrieking of those shells, like a host of angry fiends rushing through the air, the crashing of the balls through the roof and the upper stories of the house, I shall never forget to the day of my death. The agony and the terror of the next 4 hours is burnt in on my memory as with hot iron. Those are some really powerful and vivid words. It's been a long time since I've incorporated some artifacts into an episode here on Real History, and I thought I would take the opportunity to incorporate this seemingly simple artifact, but this is in fact a fragment of a spherical artillery round from one of the Fredericksburg area battlefields. It is made of cast iron. You can somewhat get a sense of how it used to be round in nature, but you can only imagine something like this flying through the air at a few hundred feet per second, utterly obliterating anything in its path. When I pass this around in the classroom, it staggers the imagination of students. A very grim relic indeed.
Stay in the basement.
Along the lines of filming at Harpers Ferry, at this scene right here, I believe in the far right-hand corner of this screenshot, you can actually see the famous Harpers Ferry engine house in which abolitionist John Brown made his final stand in October 1859. So this is a very historic area with many historical structures and resources. It's just not at Fredericksburg as the movie might have us otherwise believe. As I likewise mentioned in the previous episode, the community that is standing in for Fredericksburg, Virginia is actually Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, which is a national historical park. I spent some time there as a volunteer in my teenage years and later had the opportunity to return as a park ranger for a short spell. It is a location that is very near and dear to my heart, and during this filming, the place was utterly transformed. There were additional fake facades that were constructed, and very nervous park rangers were on hand making sure that none of the historical structures were damaged amidst all of this filming. And I remember when I first arrived at the park as a teenage volunteer, I asked a few questions. I asked, "Gods and Generals was filmed here, right?" And my one supervisor said yes, and the filmmakers aren't coming back anytime soon. And so I very much sensed that there was some tension that existed between the crew and the park staff, who were sometimes at odds with one another about what could be filmed where and what could be incorporated accordingly. One of the great challenges for the United States troops who were assaulting the downtown area of Fredericksburg is that nothing really in their training had prepared them for this mode of combat. Civil War combat typically did not take place in urban environments like this. Soldiers were accustomed from moving from field to field and woodlot to woodlot, but never really house to house and alley to alley. Such was the case here at Fredericksburg. And when many modern-day soldiers go to Fredericksburg in the form of staff rides in order to learn from what transpired there in 1862, many of them are most intrigued by this urban combat because, especially as the Iraq War was happening, these were principles that were most applicable to soldiers who were then serving in active status.
Can I be of service to you fine northern gentlemen?
Is this your master's place?
This is my place.
Here too, the scene with Martha Beale is something that is greatly exaggerated. And Park Service historian John Hennessy wrote a very good article with a lot of commentary on the Fredericksburg Battlefield blog. And he says of the part that we just saw here, the scene shown in the film is fabricated. Jane Beale wrote in her diary, quote, "I was greatly distressed to leave the servants, but they said they were not afraid of the enemy and could go over the river if they were in greater danger here," end quote. Later in her diary, she declares her relief that the house was spared damage by looters. Gods and Generals took those two passages and linked them. For what it's worth, Beale family lore holds that the house was spared because of the kindness shown to Union soldiers during the occupation that previous summer. This seems unlikely since the Union troops in the summertime occupation were on the south end of the field, and those in town would have no way to know. And so ultimately what this scene does is that it perpetuates the loyal slave myth. By choosing to represent Martha Beale in this way, the film simultaneously neglects to show the large number of African Americans who actually crossed the Rappahannock River to gain their freedom, something that was far, far, far more common than what we see depicted in this scene. It's incredibly misleading.
Put a stop to this at once. Where are the officers? Drop that soldier.
Here we see General Marcena Patrick, who was essentially in charge of military police if we were to gauge his responsibilities by today's standards. And indeed, looting was absolutely rampant within Fredericksburg once the Confederate forces were flushed from the various homes, outbuildings, and alleyways. One U.S. soldier recalled of this incident, "Furniture of all sorts is strewn along the streets. Every nameable household item or utensil or article of furniture, stoves, crockery, and glassware, pots, kettles, and tins are scattered and smashed and thrown everywhere, indoors and out, as if there had been a fallen shower of them in the midst of a mighty whirlwind." On this point, Gods and Generals does not exaggerate.
Gentlemen, these deployments are sound. The rest is in God's hands. Amen.
The aged Confederate general here who says amen in response to Robert E. Lee's comment is the late West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd, a Democratic politician who once had ties with the Ku Klux Klan. And even though he was a person very much involved in the historical preservation of Harpers Ferry and the preservation of Civil War battlefields, that was the apparent inspiration for him to be in this movie, I suppose. Man, oh man, the optics are not good in this movie when you have a former Klansman dressing up as a Confederate soldier in your movie, and it makes you wonder what were they thinking? Some people might even say it's
barbaric.
In the Roman Civil War, Julius Caesar knew he had to march on Rome itself, which no legion was permitted to do.
Here we have a great shot of one of the recreated pontoon bridges stretching across the Rappahannock as the sun comes up. In actuality, this was filmed at a lake just outside of Hagerstown, Maryland. And if I read correctly, this was the largest movie prop used in any movie in the year 2002. What you don't see off screen is a bunch of crew members with paddles along the riverbanks because they had to create the notion or the image of currents, because obviously no currents in a lake. But my good friend Brad Graham, who is the owner of Historical Films, his team actually built this pontoon bridge to specifications. So they didn't take many easy shortcuts. This is the accurate real deal that we see here. So it's a really great little bit of authenticity.
Fortune, it is you I follow. Farewell to treaties. From now on, war is our judge.
I actually wouldn't be at all surprised if somebody like Joshua Chamberlain started orating bits of Shakespeare along these lines. People in Civil War America were very Shakespearean. They had a much better sense of Shakespeare and could recite it with far greater frequency than what most Americans today could. But it's at this point in the movie where, much like Stonewall Jackson praying ad nauseum throughout this film, it's scenes like this that just really grate on viewers. And it leads one critic to liken the movie to a living wax museum where you press a button and a historical character just starts speechifying. And this is yet another prime example of the movie's oratorical excess. This murky bit of filth that we see Federal soldiers slogging through at this given moment is the film's recreation of the Rappahannock Canal ditch, which was on the outskirts of town. It was essentially an abandoned piece of infrastructure stemming from the old days of canal operations. Part of it had been flushed out, but soldiers had to wade through it. It was one of the last few bits of cover and concealment that they had before they started moving across these wide open plains below Marye's Heights. And Confederate soldiers commented that they suffered continuous pot shots from soldiers who were taking refuge within that ditch. Franklin Sawyer, a soldier of the 8th Ohio Infantry, had this to say as he moved out of the community onward toward this canal ditch and onward to the heights beyond. He said, "As soon as the mist lifted, I crept stealthily along through the gardens and alleys to the last house within our lines, from which could be seen something we had to do. There is a deep mill race or canal taken from the rapids of town that completely surround the city, connecting with the river below. The bridge across this were torn up, and the canal itself was originally held by rebel sharpshooters. The plain beyond, to the foot of the hills, was crossed by numerous board and stone fences. Therefore, there's just one obstacle after another as these U.S. troops try to move forward, and that is what makes it such a deathly struggle." Here is one of the big deviations from historical reality in which the movie prefers fable over fact. There was no Irish regiment within Thomas Cobb's brigade defending the stone wall at the bottom of Marye's Heights. It simply didn't exist. And this comes out of the battle's folklore and a series of misunderstandings stemming from records and memoirs pertaining to the Irish Brigade. In actuality, this regiment was the 24th Georgia, and it was commanded by an officer by the name of Robert McMillan. And what he said to his men as the Irish Brigade emerged was this: "That's Mars Brigade. Give it to them now, boys." Therefore, there was no sentimentality about Irishmen fighting Irishmen. It simply did not happen. It makes for a very poignant scene in the film, but I'm sad to say it just did not occur. Much like the movie Gettysburg, there are a number of cameos by noted Civil War historians throughout this film. And in this particular shot of the fourth man from the left, there is the former director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, Gabor Boret, who wrote a very notable book called The Gettysburg Gospel. I'll point out some other historians along the way as we progress. And I nearly spoke too soon because in this very next shot, the first officer that we see on the right is the late Brian C. Pohanka, who was a very notable talking head in the old television series Civil War Journal, which I grew up on with reruns on the History Channel. So back to back, we have Gabor Boret and Brian Pohanka. It just didn't happen, nor did that Confederate flag with the Irish harp on it exist. Sorry.
Those fellows deserved a better fate. Their bravery is worthy of a better cause.
My heart stood still as I watched.
I would not have believed that mortal man could march into the face of such destruction.
General Armistead saying this to General Pickett likewise foreshadows with a strong degree of irony the fact that Pickett's division will be committing this same act of insanity a few months later at Gettysburg, where they too likewise charge across open plains toward a heavily defended stone wall. That may be one of my favorite shots in the entire movie, this panning of the battlefield as this silhouetted mass of humanity works their way through the chaos, men flying through the air, dirt and shrapnel flying in all directions. All the people are almost indistinguishable. It's just one big hurling mass moving forward. I think it's a great little bit of cinematography that we see there in that one sequence.
How important it is that these moves are learned so thoroughly that the men can perform them in their sleep.
Despite my many reservations with this film, I think this scene in particular is a very helpful one, especially to show students how Civil War armies marched and operated. Very few movies get this right, and I'll give credit where credit is due here, where you see a column of soldiers forming into a line of battle in the proper sort of procedure. It's just something you don't see in most Hollywood movies. And like I said, despite some of my bits of grief with this movie, this brief sequence here and the ones that follow, including the 20th Maine, I have shown in the classroom, and the students respond very well to it. It's a good depiction of Civil War combat specific to Fredericksburg. One of the other perils that the 20th Maine had to confront is that there were a lot of fences that they had to climb over or dismantle. And Chamberlain later writes in his memoirs that he and his men encountered one of these fences. He ordered them to take it down, and they were rather hesitant to do so. And he says, "Oh, I see, so you want me to take down the fence." And he kind of shamed them into doing so. And thereby they come forward and start dismantling the fence. But these were men, like so many other regiments and brigades that went before them, just went through the ringer here in front of Mary's Heights. And historian Frank O'Reilly further comments on this. The brigade engaged in, quote, a long-range musketry. A 20th Maine soldier wrote that, quote, the utter impossibility of taking the rebel position was manifest to every man in the regiment. But we blazed away at the enemy, and they at us. The brigade fired into the darkness, quote, guided by the flashes of the fine musketry of the enemy. The lurid explosions mesmerized the soldiers. The muzzle flame deepened the sunset red, recalled Chamberlain, and all was dark. I think in this entire action that we see depicted here is where we see shades of the movie Gettysburg coming back into focus, where there are certain sequences in this film that hinge on the end of really good cinematic quality. And it's a brief and not often seen throwback to this movie's predecessor in the form of Gettysburg. I think this entire 20th Maine sequence, though, is by far the strongest of the movie. And I think it's a good testament to what Abraham Lincoln said of his troops at Fredericksburg, that there was no greater courage. I also like what we see here because you get a sense of the assembly line fashion of Confederate firepower. You have one man who is loading and tearing the cartridge, another man who's using the ramrod, another man who is putting on the percussion cap, and then that man is handing it off to the guy who is right up against the stone wall firing. They're essentially able to triple their rate of firepower because they've streamlined the 10-step process that it takes to load and fire a musket. And so this is one of the contributing factors that made this assault so lethal.
Caught into a president line down there! Keep that line! Sir! What is it?
Request permission to return to the rear, sir.
And many audience members may not realize, but this 20th Maine soldier with his missing arm is the same soldier who in Chamberlain's Bowdoin College classroom asked about how we could tolerate slavery. And here we see him walking the walk, nearly giving his all in the quest to destroy slavery. To my knowledge, Joshua Chamberlain did not carry a sidearm at the Battle of Fredericksburg, nor did he carry a sidearm in nearly all of the battles that he fought in, from my understanding. And even if he had carried a sidearm, the 20th Maine was nowhere near close enough to the stone wall for that pistol to have been effective. And so this is purely to make Chamberlain evoke his inner badassery, I suppose.
Well, that war is so terrible, but we should grow too fond of it.
This line, of course, is one of Robert E. Lee's most famous one-liners of the entirety of the American Civil War, and it speaks to just how one-sided, how lopsided the Confederate victory at Fredericksburg was here, that it was so consuming in its violence that Lee's men had gained such headway that Lee could only be thankful that war was too terrible. Otherwise, we may grow to like it too much. This experience of being pinned down by enemy fire in the cold nightfall here in mid-December, it was a truly hellish experience for the U.S. troops trapped below. All the huddled masses, all the dead and wounded, using your dead comrades as cover. This was the stuff of nightmares, and it's something that Chamberlain reflected on quite often.
Mr. General, I was born a slave, and I wants to die free.
Had this film more accurately captured the enslaved experience, it would have shown the 10,000 plus enslaved African Americans who fled their masters' homes and plantations in the Fredericksburg area to seek refuge with the United States Army. We don't get a sense of that, though, in this film. And there was one formerly enslaved man by the name of John Washington, one such person who made this crossing. He said no one could be seen on the street but the colored people, and every one of them seemed to be in the best of humors. And so while Martha here seems quite sullen, that perhaps was not fully representative of how her black fellow residents of Fredericksburg were feeling with their emancipation on the horizon.
I cannot help thinking but that it helped to feed the poor victims of the Irish Brigade who fell on this very field today.
The actress who played Jane Biel, it was interesting because I read a portion of one of her interviews pertaining to the film. And all of this was filmed in the weeks following the September 11th attacks. And for her, it seemed quite easy to evoke all of these emotions about people losing their homes, their loved ones, people being killed in horrendously violent ways in large numbers, because America had just gone exactly through that in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania in the months and weeks prior. And so there were very raw emotions at play here, and some actors put that into motion.
General, you know that I'm not a believer.
Well, then I will believe for the both of us.
The actor playing General Maxcy Gregg here is none other than Buck Taylor, who played Colonel Gamble in the movie Gettysburg. He switched sides for this film, as did many other character actors featured in this movie. But more recently, he has also appeared in episodes of Yellowstone. This guy is a classic Western actor, and his career goes all the way back to episodes of Gunsmoke in the 1960s. So a great character actor incorporated into this movie. The real-life Maxcy Gregg was killed in the vicinity below Prospect Hill, which Jackson's men were defending against the U.S. troops of George Meade. And many historians make the argument this is where the real drama of the Battle of Fredericksburg unfolds, because this was the closest point that Union forces came to breaching the Confederate defenses. And we don't get any sense of it at all whatsoever here, other than this brief tip of the hat to the death of General Gregg.
Lord, what can we do?
Kill them, sir. Kill every last man of them.
This line of Jackson saying, "We must kill them all," was said, I believe, not in reference to the death of General Gregg, but it was his reaction to the U.S. saluting of Fredericksburg itself. And that was indeed something that agitated many a Confederate soldier who witnessed it from afar.
Colonel Chamberlain, your orders are to withdraw to the city.
Another cameo by a Civil War historian who I worked for at a time at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park, Dennis Fry, who is an expert on the 1862 Maryland campaign, who also happened to serve as the associate producer for this film. And in that capacity, he did a lot of the scouting for filming locations. He had a good eye for the historical terrain in Western Maryland and West Virginia, where much of this movie was filmed. And he was also instrumental in reenactor coordinating for the movie, too. And what the filmmakers had to do with this movie as they were registering reenactors to participate in the movie is that they registered them by individual rather than by unit. Because during the filming of the movie Gettysburg, units registered to participate, and then 2/3 of them wouldn't show up. And it created huge logistical problems on set when suddenly you didn't have enough people to be in key scenes. And so for this movie, they registered individuals rather than units, and I believe that made the casting process a lot more efficient on set. A lot of viewers thought that this is something that was made up, the appearance of the Northern Lights, more formally known as the Aurora Borealis. Very rarely do the Northern Lights appear so far south. You usually see them in, the Arctic or the North Pole or Alaska or Canada, really cold places in the wintertime. And Confederate soldiers perceived this heavenly appearance almost as a spiritual acknowledgement that God was on their side and had blessed their triumphant victory here over the fields of Fredericksburg. Chamberlain, too, saw it as something that was very special, almost as this heavenly send-off for United States troops in his ranks. And he said of the Aurora Borealis, "Fiery lances and banners of blood and flame, columns of pearly light, garlands of wreath and gold, all pointing upwards and beckoning on. Who would not pass on as they did, dead for their country's life, lighted to burial by the meteor splendor of their native sky?" It's in moments like this where Chamberlain's skill as a writer, a person who truly has a gift for words, comes to the forefront. And he said, in essence, these are Northern men, these are the Northern Lights, and in essence, they are being beckoned home by the Creator. Powerful stuff. It's a really good representation of how war-torn Fredericksburg was, and I'll show you an actual photograph here of some of the burned-out, shelled buildings. It took a generation or more for the civilians of Fredericksburg to recover. Moss Neck Manor was one of the primary Confederate headquarters buildings in the aftermath of the Battle of Fredericksburg. It's privately owned today, but a number of years ago I had the great opportunity to go explore the house and the grounds, and it's an incredible complex, a truly old-style a southern plantation that is steeped in multiple generations of history. And the filmmakers did a pretty good job of matching its physical appearance.
General Jackson, do you know what these decorations signify?
And here's where the movie becomes a Thomas Kincaid Confederate Christmas Carol. Ugh. I do enjoy this scene of the two opposing pickets exchanging Christmas-time pleasantries. One reason why it's so evocative is because there's no dialogue, there's nothing being said. And despite the two sharply contrasting worldviews that these two armies had, there were these instances of shared humanity. And this was often expressed among pickets who had this quiet gentleman's agreement not to shoot at one another. And the best came out of the worst, if you will, especially on holidays where they sought a little bit of goodwill on earth.
New recruits.
Mama helped me make these.
That's fine.
Jane Corbin, the little girl shown here, was a real person. She is buried below Moss Neck to this very day. And these interactions with Jackson were by and large as they appear here. They made paper soldiers. Jackson gave her a piece of gold braid from his kepi. Jackson was at ease. He assumed the role of a father figure, given that he himself was away from his own family. But how it's conveyed, it just comes across as trite and syrupy. Questions about butter biscuits, tea, sugar cookies and lemonade. It just comes across as too much. And once more, it's an example of where the film cannot decide what it wants to be. There's just too much. It can't cover everything, yet it tries to. Oh my Lord, just make it stop. Oh, just excessive. I don't even know what to say, really. A scene like this wouldn't be so dreadful if it had the sense of balance that Gettysburg had. Yeah, music was really important. It was a crucial part of morale. Officers did turn out. But when you lay it on so thick here in regard to the nostalgia of a cozy Confederate Christmas on the old plantation, you better damn well even it out with the opposing perspective. And it's just so drastically absent in this movie.
We owe you Texas boys a debt of gratitude for putting on these shows.
Colonel Patton, any man who can't handle a guitar or a fiddle ain't fit to carry a musket.
Yet another cameo we see here by none other than Ted Turner, who was the executive producer and benefactor of this film. Ted Turner put up largely his own money, a good portion of the $60 million budget for this film, and he wasn't going to get most of it back, and that's why we don't have the last film of this trilogy, the last full measure. I will say this about Ted Turner. I respect him a lot of regards because he's put up a lot of money for a lot of really important historical films, whether it be on the big screen or the small screen, that got people like me interested in history when I was young. If you think about all the TNT originals that aired on his network throughout the 1990s, Gettysburg among them. And when I was a teenager and I wrote my first book, a small kid's book on the Civil War during my junior year in high school, an acquaintance of mine actually sent along a copy of that book to Ted Turner. And in June of 2005, I received the following note from him. Dear Mr. Frederick, I appreciated a copy of your book and congratulate you on your book. I think it shows a lot of talent and initiative on your part. Good luck and much success, Ted Turner. And so that's my fun little personal connection here to this movie, having received a letter as such from the producer of this, and a visionary for the communication and entertainment industry. And of course, his greatest accomplishment of all is the creation of my favorite TV channel, and that is Turner Classic Movies. I am glad that this scene was incorporated because Stonewall Jackson could have a mean streak in him. He was a fierce disciplinarian. He often did not get along with subordinates. He had cross words to share with Maxie Gregg before he bade him a nice deathbed farewell. He didn't get along with the likes of Richard Garnett, who, in feeling that he had to compensate for this cloud that he was under, rode to mortality during Pickett's charge. Stonewall Jackson had a long list of high-ranking Confederate officers that he was cross with, and accordingly, he was not universally loved within the Stonewall Brigade or his corps. And during the wintertime especially, desertion rates in both armies could be exceedingly high. And Jackson was not one to countenance any sort of dereliction of duty. And of course, desertion was the biggest dereliction of duty of all. And so we do get this darker side of Jackson after all of these scenes with songs and butter biscuits. All that being said, that brings us to the conclusion of this episode 2 of our breakdown of Gods and Generals. And these are some of my concluding thoughts. In many ways, I wish this movie had focused exclusively on the Battle of Fredericksburg. In the novel, Gods and Generals by Jeff Shera, this is the only battle in the book in which all 4 of the main characters participate. I think this would have been a much stronger film, not only if it had remained true to its source material, but if it had taken only a sliver of the source material and made it a solid 2 to 2.5 hour film. That would have cut off a lot of the excess fat and superfluous subplot, and it would have been a character study in command and leadership in much the same way that the movie Gettysburg had. But instead, they opted to go with the overly long epic route, and unfortunately, it did just not work. As we always do, though, here on Real History, I have some reading recommendations for you before you head out. And the first of which is The Fredericksburg Campaign, Winter War on the Rappahannock by Frank O'Reilly, who, like I said, is a park ranger at the Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania battlefields. If you're looking for a good strategic and tactical assessment of the Battle of Fredericksburg, you can't do any better than this one. If instead you would like a really strong social history of the Battle of Fredericksburg, this is a newer one by John Matson, which is called A Worse Place Than Hell: How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed a Nation. This takes us on a journey through Fredericksburg and beyond through the eyes of 5 individuals who were transformed by that conflict. And it is social history at its best. And then last but not least, as I've mentioned before, you have to read the original book, the novel, Gods and Generals by Jeff Shera. This is a film that does not give this book justice, and it's most definitely worth a look. It is worth your time to read. That brings an end to this episode of Real History. Thank you once again for tuning in. We would love to hear your respectful comments on the movie Gods and Generals in the comments section below. And in addition, we welcome you to check out our other websites and resources, including our website, realhistoryfilms.com. Check out our Teespring store, and we encourage your support via Patreon as well. We always appreciate your support in whatever form. Be sure to join us next time on Real History as we look at part 3 of Gods and Generals, set in the year 1863. More great conversation to come. Until then, stay curious.